You are living in Rome in the year 192 AD, and the empire is ruled by the most deranged emperor in its history. His name is Commodus, son of the philosopher emperor Marcus Aurelius, and he believes he is the reincarnation of the god Hercules. He does not govern. He does not lead armies. He does not care about the Senate or the people. Instead, he spends his days in the Colosseum, fighting as a gladiator, convinced that his divine strength makes him invincible. And you are about to witness his final performance. The story of how an emperor was killed by a gladiator is not a legend. It is historical fact documented by Roman historians. But to understand how this moment came to be, you need to understand the madness that consumed the most powerful man in the world, and the desperation of those forced to serve him. Commodus became emperor in 180 AD, when his father Marcus Aurelius died. Marcus Aurelius was everything a Roman emperor should be: wise, just, and dedicated to the empire. His son was the opposite. From the moment Commodus took power, it became clear that something was deeply wrong with him. He was not interested in governance. He was obsessed with gladiatorial combat. Roman emperors were expected to attend the games, to sit in the imperial box and watch the spectacle. But Commodus did not want to watch. He wanted to fight. He wanted to be in the arena, killing animals and defeating opponents, proving to Rome that he was the greatest warrior who had ever lived. And because he was emperor, no one could stop him. At first, Commodus fought animals in private exhibitions. He would enter the arena and kill lions, elephants, and other exotic beasts with a spear or bow. These were not fair fights. The animals were often drugged or wounded beforehand to ensure the emperor's safety. But Commodus did not care about fairness. He cared about glory. He wanted Rome to worship him as a god. The Roman people watched these spectacles with growing horror. An emperor fighting like a common gladiator was a disgrace. It violated every tradition of Roman dignity. The Senate was appalled but powerless. Commodus had surrounded himself with loyal guards and dismissed anyone who criticized him. He was untouchable, or so he believed. As the years passed, Commodus's behavior became more erratic. He began to appear in the arena as a gladiator, fighting against criminals and disabled opponents who had no chance of defending themselves. He would enter the Colosseum dressed as Hercules, wearing a lion's skin and carrying a club. The crowd was forced to cheer. Anyone who showed displeasure was noted by imperial spies and could be arrested, tortured, or executed. Commodus renamed Rome after himself. He renamed the months of the year after his titles. He renamed the legions, the Senate, even the people of Rome itself. Everything was to be associated with his glory. He declared himself a living god and demanded worship. The empire was descending into madness, and at the center of it all was an emperor who cared only about fighting in the arena. The financial cost of Commodus's obsession was staggering. He paid himself enormous fees for his appearances as a gladiator, draining the imperial treasury. He charged the Senate hundreds of thousands of sesterces to watch him fight. He demanded gifts and tributes. Meanwhile, the actual governance of the empire was neglected. Provinces were ignored. Military campaigns were abandoned. Rome was being destroyed from within by an emperor who wanted to be a gladiator. The aristocracy began to plot against him. There had been several failed assassination attempts. Commodus's own sister had tried to have him killed and was executed for it. But Commodus survived every plot, protected by his Praetorian guards and his paranoia. He trusted no one. He saw conspiracies everywhere, and he was right to be paranoid because everyone wanted him dead. You do not know his full name. History records him only as Narcissus. He was not a famous gladiator. He was not a champion of the arena who fought for glory and crowds. He was something more humble and more deadly, a wrestling instructor and occasional fighter who worked in the imperial household. He trained athletes and gladiators. He was strong, skilled, and unremarkable, exactly the kind of person no one would suspect. Narcissus had been brought into the conspiracy by Commodus's inner circle. The emperor's closest advisors, his chamberlain Eclectus, his concubine Marcia, and the Praetorian prefect Latus, had decided that Commodus must die. The emperor had become too dangerous. His madness was threatening everyone, including them. They knew that eventually Commodus's paranoia would turn on them, and they would be executed like so many others. They had to act first. The plan was poison. Marcia, who was Commodus's favorite concubine, would put poison in his wine during a feast. Commodus would drink, become ill, and die quietly in his chambers. It would look like a natural death. The conspirators would take control, install a new emperor, and restore sanity to Rome. It was a simple plan, but it failed. On the night of December 31st, 192 AD, Marcia served Commodus poisoned wine at a feast. The emperor drank deeply. The poison took effect quickly. Commodus became violently ill. He began vomiting, but he did not die. His body, strengthened by years of athletic training, was fighting off the poison. He was weakening but still alive, and worse, he was beginning to realize what was happening. He was being murdered. The conspirators panicked. If Commodus survived, they would all be tortured and executed. They needed him dead immediately. But how do you kill an emperor in his own palace, surrounded by guards? You send someone the guards will not suspect. You send a servant. You send a wrestling instructor named Narcissus. Narcissus was brought to Commodus's chambers. The emperor was lying on his bed, weak from the poison, vomiting and barely conscious. He could not call for help. He could not defend himself. This was the moment. Narcissus approached the bed, and then he did what no one else in the empire had been able to do. He killed the emperor. The historical sources describe what happened next in simple terms. Narcissus strangled Commodus. But those words do not capture the reality of what occurred in that room. This was not a quick death. This was a struggle between two strong men, one fighting for his life, the other fighting to save his own. Commodus was weakened by poison, but still dangerous. He was a trained fighter, stronger than most men with years of combat experience. Even sick and disoriented, his body knew how to fight. When Narcissus's hands closed around his throat, Commodus fought back. He grabbed at Narcissus's arms. He tried to break the hold. He thrashed and kicked. The room was destroyed in the struggle. Furniture was overturned. Objects were knocked to the floor. And through it all, Narcissus held on. Strangulation is not quick. It takes minutes for a person to lose consciousness and several more minutes for them to die. Narcissus had to maintain his grip through all of it. He had to ignore Commodus's desperate attempts to fight back. He had to keep squeezing as the emperor's struggles grew weaker. He had to hold on as Commodus's body finally went limp, and then he had to keep holding on, making sure the emperor was truly dead. When it was over, Narcissus stood in the ruined chambers of the emperor, his hand still shaking, looking down at the body of the most powerful man in the world. Commodus was dead. The mad emperor who believed he was a god, who had terrorized Rome for 12 years, who had degraded the imperial office by fighting as a gladiator, was finally gone, and he had been killed not in battle, not by a noble assassin, but by a wrestling instructor whose name would barely be remembered. The conspirators moved quickly. They sealed the palace. They sent messages to the Senate. They installed Pertinax, an elderly senator, as the new emperor. By morning, the official story was that Commodus had died of natural causes. The truth that he had been poisoned and then strangled by a member of his household was kept secret. Rome was told that the emperor had simply died. The nightmare was over. What happened to Narcissus? The historical record is silent. He disappears from history after that night. He was not rewarded publicly. He was not celebrated. He was a tool used by the conspirators and then discarded. Perhaps he was paid and sent away. Perhaps he was killed to ensure his silence. Perhaps he lived out his days quietly, knowing he had done what no army could do. He had killed an emperor. The new emperor Pertinax tried to restore sanity to Rome. He reversed many of Commodus's insane policies. He tried to restore fiscal responsibility, but he lasted only 3 months before he too was murdered by the Praetorian Guard. The death of Commodus had solved nothing. Rome descended into a period called the Year of the Five Emperors, as various generals fought for control of the empire. The instability would continue for years, but in that moment, on New Year's Eve in 192 AD, none of that mattered. What mattered was that the mad emperor was dead. The man who had humiliated Rome by fighting as a gladiator had been killed by a gladiator. There is a brutal poetry to that ending. Commodus wanted to be remembered as the greatest fighter who ever lived. Instead, he is remembered as the emperor who was so weak, so hated, that he was strangled in his own bed by a man whose name history barely recorded. Modern historians have tried to understand what was wrong with Commodus. Was he simply cruel and narcissistic, or was there something clinically wrong with him? We will never know for certain, but the pattern of behavior, the grandiosity, the paranoia, the obsession with gladiatorial combat, the belief that he was a god, suggests severe mental illness. Commodus was not fit to rule. He should never have been emperor. But Rome had no mechanism for removing an unfit emperor. Once someone held imperial power, they kept it until they died or were overthrown. The Senate was powerless. The people were powerless. Only those closest to the emperor could act, and they acted only when their own lives were threatened. The system that had built the greatest empire in history had no way to save itself from one insane man. The story of Narcissus and Commodus is a reminder of how fragile power really is. Commodus commanded legions. He controlled the wealth of an empire. He was worshipped as a god, but in the end, he died like anyone else, struggling for breath, unable to save himself, killed by hands around his throat. All his power, all his delusions of divinity could not protect him from one determined man in a dark room. This is the true story of the gladiator who defeated an emperor. Not a legend, not a myth, historical fact. And you would not have survived being anywhere near this story, because everyone connected to Commodus, whether they served him or betrayed him, suffered. That was the reality of living in Rome under a mad emperor. Welcome to ancient Rome.